For nearly 1,000 years, the Catholic Church maintained an intelligence network that would make modern spy agencies weep with envy. Not from frustration, mind you, but from sheer professional admiration. Medieval peasants whispered that the church had eyes everywhere, in every village, every confession booth, every traveling friar's 2 friendly questions about your reading habits. Historians long dismissed these fears as superstitious paranoia, the fevered dreams of uneducated masses who didn't understand how institutions actually worked. Not metaphorically right, not spiritually right, but operationally, documentably, leather-bound registry right. Tonight, we're stepping into the original surveillance state, where your sins were cataloged in Vatican Archives, your neighbors were incentivized to report you, and the concept of privacy hadn't been invented yet because the church had already decided it wasn't something you deserved. The walls have ears and they're taking notes. Picture a village in 13th century France, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the church bells mark the hours, and where a peasant named, let's say, Guillaume, lies awake at night with a specific kind of terror crawling through his stomach. Guillaume had complained about the local lord's new tax. Not loudly, not publicly, just a muttered comment to his brother-in-law while mending a fence. 3 days later, the traveling friar who'd been so friendly at the market asked Guillaume, quite casually, what he thought about the proper relationship between secular and spiritual authority. The question felt pointed. The friar's smile felt knowing. Guillaume became convinced that someone had reported him, that the church knew, that somewhere in some distant monastery or Roman palace, his name was being written down in a book of troublemakers. Modern readers might smile at Guillaume's paranoia. Poor, superstitious medieval peasant, unable to distinguish between the natural social dynamics of small village life and some vast ecclesiastical conspiracy. Surely the church had better things to do than track the grumblings of illiterate farmers about tax policy. Except Guillaume was absolutely correct. The church did have better things to do. It did them anyway. What Guillaume sensed, what kept him staring at the ceiling while his wife slept peacefully beside him, was the presence of a surveillance apparatus more sophisticated than anything the world had seen since the Roman Empire, and more invasive than anything that would exist again until the 20th century. The confession booth where Guillaume whispered his sins into the darkness was not the sealed chamber of absolute privacy that doctrine promised. The traveling friars, with their friendly questions and their remarkable interest in local gossip, were not simply curious. The neighbor who seemed a little too eager to discuss Guillaume's religious opinions was not making idle conversation. Every village had eyes. Every diocese had ears. Every confession left traces. And somewhere in Rome, in archives that would eventually grow to contain over 50 miles of shelving, the church was keeping records. The paranoid peasant fantasy, it turns out, was an underestimate. The reality was worse. More systematic. More permanent. And far, far better organized. This is the story of how the Catholic Church built history's first comprehensive surveillance state, and how medieval conspiracy theories were simply accurate descriptions of institutional policy. The peasants weren't crazy. They were paying attention. The seal of confession is one of the most sacred principles in Catholic doctrine. What is spoken between penitent and priest in the sacrament of reconciliation is absolutely confidential, protected by penalties up to and including excommunication for any priest who reveals it. This principle was formally codified at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, and it remains church law to this day. So the confession booth was completely private and secure, right? Oh, you sweet summer child. The seal of confession protected the specific content of individual confessions. It did not protect patterns. It did not protect categories. And it absolutely did not protect anything that smelled like heresy. Bishops across medieval Europe required their parish priests to submit regular reports on the spiritual health of their communities. These reports didn't name names, technically. They described trends. Father Michel might report that his parish showed concerning levels of doubt about transubstantiation, or that several parishioners had expressed sympathy for Waldensian ideas, or that there seemed to be unusual interest in translated scripture. The bishop would then dispatch investigators. The investigators would ask questions. The questions would be remarkably specific for people who supposedly had no idea what was happening in those sealed confession booths. But the real hole in the seal was something called reserved sins. Certain offenses were so serious that ordinary priests lacked the authority to authority them. Heresy, obviously. Apostasy. Violence against clergy. Certain sexual sins. For these, the penitent had to be referred upward to someone with appropriate authority. Usually a bishop. Sometimes Rome itself. This referral process created documentation. The sin had to be described. The penitent had to be identified. Forms had to be filled out. And suddenly, the sealed confession had become an official church record, complete with name, date, location, and detailed description of the offense. The leather-bound registries that recorded these reserved sin referrals still exist in diocesan archives across Europe. They are exactly as detailed as you'd fear. Names, family connections, patterns of offense, dates of confession, outcomes of episcopal review. Entire villages' moral landscapes, documented and preserved. The confession booth wasn't bugged in the modern sense. No hidden microphones, no concealed observers. It was something more elegant than that. The system was designed so that the most serious sins, the ones that actually mattered to church authorities, automatically generated their own paperwork. The peasants who feared their confessions weren't private were operating on outdated information. Their confessions weren't private. They hadn't been private for centuries. The mendicant orders arrived in the 13th century like a breath of fresh air. Franciscans with their joyful poverty, Dominicans with their intellectual rigor, Carmelites and Augustinians spreading across Europe's roads and marketplaces. Unlike monks who stayed in their monasteries, these friars moved. They preached in town squares. They begged for their bread. They talked to people. They talked to people a lot. The official purpose of the mendicant orders was renewal. They were supposed to bring the church back to its apostolic roots, to counter the growing wealth and corruption of the established ecclesiastical hierarchy by embodying Christ-like simplicity. And many of them did exactly that, with genuine devotion and admirable poverty. But the church, being the church, noticed something useful about these wandering holy men. They went everywhere. They talked to everyone. They were trusted. And they were literate. Within decades of their founding, both the Franciscan and Dominican orders had been explicitly tasked with identifying and reporting heresy. The Dominicans went further. When Pope Gregory IX established the Papal Inquisition in 1231, he staffed it almost entirely with Dominican friars. The order of preachers became, in effect, the order of interrogators. But even the friars who never served as formal inquisitors were gathering intelligence. Their constitutions required them to report anything concerning to their superiors. Their mobility meant they could compare what they heard in one village to what they heard in the next. Their trusted status meant people told them things. The friendly friar at the market, the one asking about your family and your neighbors and what books you might have seen, was not making conversation. He was conducting an interview. Every question had a purpose. Every answer went somewhere. The Dominicans developed actual interrogation techniques, documented in manuals that still survive. How to put a suspect at ease. How to ask the same question different ways to catch inconsistencies. How to use confession seal to extract information and then find other witnesses to justify acting on it. How to seem friendly while cataloging every word for future reference. The traveling friar conspiracy theory posited that these men were church spies disguised as humble preachers. The reality was simpler and more disturbing. They were humble preachers who were also, officially and systematically, church spies. The disguise was the job description. Medieval peasants learned to be careful around friars. This was not paranoia. This was pattern recognition. Here is a moral principle that medieval Christians absorbed with their mother's milk. Failure to report heresy is itself a sin. Not a minor sin, either. A mortal sin. The kind that sends souls to hell. This doctrine was not subtle. It was preached from pulpits, reinforced in confession, and backed by both spiritual and temporal penalties. If your neighbor expressed doubt about the real presence, and you didn't report it, and that neighbor later fell into full heresy, their damnation was partially your fault. Their blood was on your hands. You had failed in Christian charity by not giving church authorities the chance to correct them. The theological reasoning was elegant. The practical effect was comprehensive surveillance. But spiritual incentives weren't the only tool. The church also offered more tangible rewards. Informants who provided useful information about heretics could receive portions of confiscated property. They could gain favorable treatment in their own dealings with ecclesiastical courts. They could earn the visible approval of powerful clergy, which translated into social status and economic opportunity. Conversely, those who failed to inform faced consequences. Known associates of heretics were investigated. Communities that harbored heresy faced collective punishments. The message was clear. Cooperation was safe, silence was suspicious. The parish system made all of this terrifyingly efficient. Every Christian in Europe was assigned to a specific parish with a specific priest who knew, or was supposed to know, every soul in their care. The priest kept records of who attended Mass, who confessed regularly, who received communion. Absence was noted. Irregularity was flagged. And the parishioners watched each other. Not because they were evil necessarily, but because the church had constructed a system where watching each other was virtuous. Where reporting your neighbor wasn't betrayal but charity. Where silence was complicity. The village informant conspiracy imagined shadowy figures receiving payments in dark corners. The reality was Sunday Mass, where everyone could see who attended and who didn't. The reality was the neighbor who noticed you eating meat on Friday. The reality was the cousin who wondered why you weren't having your children baptized. The church didn't need to plant informants. It had convinced an entire continent that informing was a Christian duty. The surveillance network wasn't infiltrating communities. It was the community. The Vatican's secret archives are not, despite their name, particularly secret. Scholars have had access since 1881. What they are, however, is enormous. The archives contain approximately 53 miles of shelving. That's not a metaphor. If you laid the shelves end to end, you could walk from the Vatican to the outskirts of Rome and back again. Papal correspondence, diplomatic records, financial accounts, and the files of every tribunal, investigation, and administrative action the Church has ever conducted, including the Inquisition records. The Holy Office, as the Inquisition was formerly known, was meticulous. Interrogations were transcribed. Accusations were documented. Evidence was catalogued. Family connections were mapped. Outcomes were recorded. And everything was preserved. When inquisitors investigated a suspected heretic, they didn't just look at the individual. They looked at the family. Parents, children, siblings, spouses, cousins. Had any of them faced investigation? Had any been penanced? Had any been condemned? Heresy was understood to run in bloodlines, like a spiritual disease. Your great-grandmother's flirtation with Catharism could surface in your file 2 centuries later. This wasn't theoretical. The archives contain cases where investigators explicitly cited ancestral heresy as evidence against descendants. The sins of the fathers were visited upon the children, not metaphorically but documentarily, with dates and citations. And it wasn't just the Inquisition. Marriage investigations required documentation of family history going back generations to ensure no impediments existed. Dispensation requests for marriages within prohibited degrees of kinship required detailed family trees. Ordination candidates faced background checks that would make a modern security clearance look casual. The Church kept files. The Church kept files on everyone. The Church kept files forever. Medieval Christians who feared that their names were written in distant registries were not suffering from persecution complexes. Their names probably were written in distant registries. And those registries were being updated, cross-referenced, and preserved for future reference. The written record conspiracy imagined a vast bureaucracy cataloging the population. The Vatican Archive is that bureaucracy. It just also happens to contain 1,200 years of European history, some lovely medieval illuminations, and the trial records of Galileo. The surveillance state kept excellent notes. Papal nuncios were, officially, the Pope's ambassadors to secular courts. They represented the Holy See in diplomatic matters, negotiated treaties, and maintained the Church's relationships with Catholic monarchs across Europe. Unoffensively, they were also spy masters. The nuncio system created something unprecedented in medieval intelligence, a network of highly educated, deeply trusted observers positioned in every major court in Christendom. These men had access to kings, queens, ministers, and nobles. They attended council meetings. They heard gossip. They received confidences. And they reported everything to Rome. The correspondence between nuncios and the Vatican fills entire archive sections. Political developments, military movements, succession concerns, economic conditions, diplomatic intrigues. The Pope often knew about conspiracies before the conspirators had finished conspiring. He knew about rebellions before the rebels had recruited. He knew about wars before the declarations were written. But the nuncios were only the top layer. Below them sat an entire infrastructure of clerical observers. Every noble household had a chaplain. Every court had confessors. Every diplomatic mission included ecclesiastical advisors. Every one of them was part of the Church's information network, whether they thought of themselves that way or not. Bishops reported on their local nobility. Abbots reported on noble patrons of their monasteries. Parish priests reported on the gentry in their parishes. The Church was present everywhere political power existed, and presence meant intelligence. Cardinals traded information like currency because it was currency. Political intelligence determined outcomes in papal elections, influenced appointments to lucrative benefices, and shaped alliances that could last for generations. A cardinal who knew things was a cardinal who mattered. The political intelligence conspiracy imagined the Pope as a master manipulator, pulling strings across Europe through secret agents and hidden networks. The reality was both less dramatic and more comprehensive. The Pope didn't need secret agents. He had public ones. The entire ecclesiastical infrastructure was an intelligence network. The bishops weren't infiltrating the nobility. They were dining with them, confessing them, baptizing their children, and writing detailed reports about everything they learned. When medieval lords feared that Rome knew their secrets, they weren't being paranoid. Rome almost certainly did know their secrets. Their confessors had written them down. In 1559, Pope Paul IV published the first papal index of forbidden books. It listed works that Catholics were prohibited from reading, owning, printing, or selling. The index would be updated regularly for the next 4 centuries, eventually listing over 4,000 titles before being finally abolished in 1966. The index wasn't just about controlling information. It was about controlling thought. Consider what happens when you ban a book. You're not simply preventing access to specific words on specific pages. You're declaring that certain ideas are dangerous to think. That exposure to certain arguments might corrupt the mind. That the interior life of the reader is legitimately the Church's concern. But the index was only the most visible expression of a deeper project. The Church claimed authority over belief itself, not just behavior. Heresy wasn't defined by what you did. It was defined by what you thought. This created a fundamental problem for enforcement. Thoughts are invisible. You can observe whether someone attends Mass. You cannot observe whether they believe in transubstantiation while they're there. The Inquisition's solution was to make thoughts visible through their traces. What books did you read? What questions did you ask? What sermons made you uncomfortable? Who did you associate with? What did your face look like when the priest elevated the host? Inquisitors became experts in reading signs of interior belief. A hesitation before affirming doctrine. A choice of words that seemed too careful. A reputation for asking the wrong questions. None of these proved anything. All of them could condemn. The accusations that emerged from this system were unfalsifiable by design. How could you prove you didn't secretly doubt? How could you demonstrate interior belief? The accused were trapped in a system where their own thoughts were the crime and their only witness was God, who had apparently authorized the Inquisition to speak on his behalf. The thought police conspiracy imagined a church that wanted to control minds, not just bodies. The Index, the heresy trials, the whole apparatus of interior surveillance confirmed exactly that. The goal wasn't obedience. The goal was orthodoxy, all the way down to the unspoken corners of the soul. Medieval Christians who feared they might be condemned for what they thought were not misunderstanding the system. They were understanding it perfectly. In 1302, Pope Boniface VIII faced a problem. His predecessor, Celestine V, had abdicated the papacy, which was canonically questionable and politically inconvenient. Then Celestine died, which simplified things. But Boniface's enemies kept accusing him of having murdered Celestine, which complicated them again. Boniface's solution? Put the dead pope on trial. Not metaphorically. An actual trial, with actual proceedings, to formally establish that Celestine had not been murdered. The corpse was exhumed. Evidence was presented. Witnesses testified. The deceased was found innocent of being murdered, which must have come as a relief to his remains. This was not unusual. Posthumous trials were a recognized part of church procedure. You could be investigated, tried, and condemned years or decades after your death. Your reputation could be destroyed. Your legacy could be erased. And there were consequences for the living. When a deceased person was found guilty of heresy, their body was exhumed and burned. But more importantly, their property was confiscated retroactively. Inheritances were invalidated. Descendants lost what they'd received. The dead hand of the heretic reached forward through time to strip their children and grandchildren of houses, lands, and social standing. This wasn't accidental. It was policy. Heresy was understood to taint bloodlines. The children of heretics faced restrictions on holding church offices, entering religious orders, or contracting certain marriages. The great-grandchildren of heretics could still find their ancestors' sins raised against them in background investigations. The church's memory was institutional and permanent. What was documented stayed documented. What was investigated remained investigated. The file never closed. Medieval Christians who feared that their sins would follow their descendants were not being dramatic. They were being accurate. The surveillance state didn't end at death. It reached backward to judge the dead and forward to punish the yet unborn. The eternal surveillance conspiracy imagined a church that watched forever. The archive proves they were right. Somewhere in Rome, in those 53 miles of shelving, there may still be a file on your family. The paperwork outlasts everything. In 1791, the philosopher Jeremy Bentham proposed a revolutionary prison design called the panopticon. A central observation tower surrounded by cells, arranged so that guards could see into any cell at any time, but prisoners could never tell whether they were being watched. The genius of the design wasn't surveillance itself. It was the uncertainty. Prisoners who might be observed at any moment would behave as though they were always observed. The watching became internalized. The prison became the prisoner's own mind. Bentham thought he'd invented something new. He had not. The Catholic Church had been running this experiment for 800 years. Consider medieval Christianity's information architecture. The confession booth, where your sins might or might not be recorded. The traveling friar, who might or might not be gathering intelligence. The neighbor, who might or might not report you. The archive, which might or might not contain your name. At every point, surveillance was possible but not certain. This uncertainty was the mechanism of control. You didn't need to actually watch everyone. You just needed everyone to believe they might be watched. The eye of God became operationalized as the eye of the church, and that eye was everywhere and nowhere, certain and uncertain, watching and maybe not watching. The behavioral effect was profound. Medieval Christians policed themselves. They monitored their own thoughts for heresy before the Inquisition could find it. They watched their own words, their own associations, their own reading choices. The external surveillance apparatus succeeded by becoming internal surveillance. The panopticon was built from guilt and architecture of the soul. Modern surveillance states understand this principle intimately. The camera that might be monitored. The algorithm that might flag your search history. The device that might be listening. The goal isn't comprehensive surveillance, which is impossible. The goal is comprehensive uncertainty, which changes behavior just as effectively. The medieval church pioneered this technology, not with electronics, but with doctrine, social structure, and very good record-keeping. The peasants who felt watched were responding to a real feature of their environment. The system was designed to make them feel watched. That was the whole point. So here's the ironic coda to our story of conspiracy theories that were true. The medieval peasants were right that the church had eyes everywhere. But the church's greatest achievement wasn't the eyes themselves. It was convincing people to imagine eyes where none existed, to watch themselves when no one else was watching, to carry the surveillance state inside their own heads. The conspiracy was real. And its greatest success was making people conspire against themselves. Somewhere in the Vatican Archives, there may be a file with your ancestors' names in it. But the real legacy of the church's surveillance state isn't paper. It's the lingering sense, felt by believers and non-believers alike, that someone might be watching. that someone might be keeping track. The buildings decay. The archives crumble. But the feeling of being observed, that's the inheritance that keeps on giving. The original panopticon wasn't made of glass and steel. It was made of guilt, uncertainty, and the eternal suspicion that your thoughts might not be entirely your own. The peasants knew. They were right to be afraid. Some families passed down jewelry. Others passed down land, or grudges, or recipes for soup. The Yelu clan passed down something far more durable, the knowledge of how to survive when empires change hands. Yelu Chucai was born in 1190 in Beijing, which sounds simple enough until you realize that Beijing in 1190 was less a city and more a palimpsest of conquered peoples pretending to get along. His family were Khitan nobility, which meant they had once ruled their own empire, the Liao, until the Jurchen Jin dynasty swept down and explained, with considerable violence, that they would be ruling now. The Yelis adapted. They took positions in the new administration. They filed paperwork for their conquerors and taught their children to do the same. This was not cowardice. This was professional survival. The household young Chucai grew up and smelled of ink and old paper, the particular mustiness of administrative records that outlast the regimes that created them. His grandfather had served the Liao. His father served the Jin. The lesson was clear. Armies come and go, but someone always needs to count the grain. He studied the Confucian classics, because that was what educated men did. He absorbed Buddhist philosophy, because that was what thoughtful men did. He learned astronomy, divination, and calendar making, because those were the technologies that made empires run on time. Knowing when to plant crops, when to expect eclipses, when the seasons would turn, these weren't mystical arts. They were infrastructure. And sometimes, when the wind shifted wrong, he could smell smoke from the north. Mongol raids were becoming more frequent, more organized, more like conquest and less like mere theft. The Jin dynasty fortified walls and raised armies and did all the things empires do when they sense their own mortality. Yelu Chucai watched and calculated and kept his thoughts to himself. He was 25 when Genghis Khan's forces reached Beijing. He was a minor official by then, a young man with a remarkable beard and an even more remarkable talent for looking at chaos and seeing systems underneath. The city fell in 1215 after a brutal siege. The Mongols poured through streets that Chucai had walked his entire life, and the smoke that had once been distant became immediate, acrid, inescapable. Most scholars fled or died. Yelu Chucai did neither. He stayed, and he watched the conquerors struggle with a problem they hadn't anticipated. They were very good at breaking things and absolutely terrible at running them. Here's something the history books often skip. Yelu Chucai became a Buddhist monk. Not a hermit meditating on mountaintops, mind you, but the other kind of monk, the kind who runs temple finances and tracks donations and makes sure the incense inventory stays balanced. A monk who never stopped counting. The ordination gave him cover during dangerous years. It gave him access to libraries. It gave him time to master the arts that would later make him indispensable, the the calculation of celestial movements, the prediction of eclipses, the mathematics of calendars that kept agricultural societies from starving. These skills looked like magic to the uninitiated. To Yelu Chucai, they were simply applied record-keeping with better optics. The monastery smelled of sandalwood and lamp oil, a gentler atmosphere than the charred ruins outside its walls. Beijing under early Mongol occupation was a city learning what it meant to be conquered by people who didn't particularly want to live in cities. The Mongols took what they wanted, killed who annoyed them, and otherwise seemed baffled by the concept of urban administration. Yelu Chucai watched them try to count their own loot and fail. This was not a metaphor. The Mongols were genuinely struggling with basic inventory management. They had conquered a civilization that ran on written records, taxation schedules, and bureaucratic hierarchy, and they had no idea what to do with any of it. They could defeat armies of hundreds of thousands. They could not locate all the granaries they'd seized. The scholar monk observed. He took notes. He began to understand something that would shape the rest of his life. These conquerors were not stupid. They were simply operating with a completely different set of assumptions about how wealth worked. On the steppe, wealth moved on hooves. Cattle, horses, sheep, these were countable, portable, self-replicating assets. Farmland was incomprehensible to them. Why would anyone stay in one place and dig in dirt when you could simply take what you needed and move on? The Mongols' confusion was an opportunity. Someone would eventually explain agriculture to them. Someone would teach them that peasants, properly managed, produced more value alive than dead. Someone would sell them on the revolutionary concept of sustainable extraction. Yelu Chucai realized, with a mixture of ambition and horror, that someone would probably have to be him. The summons came in 1218. Genghis Khan, having conquered most of northern China and moved on to other campaigns, wanted to meet the tall scholar everyone kept mentioning. The one who hadn't fled. The one who could supposedly predict the movements of stars. The jur tent where the audience took place smelled of leather, horse sweat, and wood smoke, the signature perfume of Mongol power. Felt walls held in warmth from a central fire. Animal skins covered the floor. Everything was designed for mobility, for people who measured home and horizons rather than walls. Yelu Chucai was conspicuously out of place. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, which was remarkable anywhere, but especially among the compact steppe warriors. His beard cascaded down his chest like a waterfall of authority. He dressed in the robes of a Chinese scholar official, which in this context was either an act of absurd bravery or cultural obliviousness. Genghis Khan studied him with the patient evaluation of a man who had conquered more territory than any human in history. Then he asked a simple question: "Why didn't you run?" The scholar's answer would determine whether he lived or died, and he knew it. Lesser men might have groveled. Cleverer men might have lied. Yelu Chucai did something unexpected. He told the truth. He said he had served his previous masters with complete loyalty. His family had served the Liao, then the Jin, with the same devotion. If the Khan became his master, he would serve with equal faithfulness. Loyalty was not something he offered to whoever happened to be winning. It was something he owed to whoever legitimately commanded him. This was exactly the right answer, though not for the reason most people assume. Genghis Khan didn't value obsequiousness. He valued reliability. A man who would betray his previous masters might betray his new ones. A man who served faithfully, even to fallen lords, could be trusted. The Khan appointed Yelu Chucai as a bichichi, a scribe, which sounds humble until you realize that literacy itself was a rare technology in the Mongol command structure. The scholar would travel with the army. He would keep records. He would make himself useful. The steppe warriors watched this strange, towering Chinese bureaucrat join their world and mostly felt contempt. What use was a man who couldn't ride, couldn't shoot, couldn't fight? What value lay in counting things when you could simply take them? They would learn. It would take time, and it would require Yelu Chucai to translate his entire worldview into terms that conquerors could understand. But they would learn. The first breakthrough came, as these things often do, through superior weather forecasting. During a campaign in Central Asia, Yelu Chucai predicted an eclipse with perfect accuracy. To the Chinese bureaucratic tradition, this was simply competent astronomy, the kind of thing educated officials were expected to know. To the Mongol warriors, it looked like sorcery. Here was a man who could tell when the sun would disappear and return. A man whose strange calculations touched the heavens themselves. Genghis Khan began consulting his peculiar scribe more frequently. The real value, though, lay in more mundane magic. Yelu Chucai could calculate logistics. He could look at an army of 100,000 men and tell you exactly how much grain they needed, how many horses would die crossing a desert, how long a siege could last before starvation set in. These weren't guesses. These were mathematics, centuries of accumulated administrative knowledge distilled into practical wisdom. The click of abacus beads became a familiar sound in planning sessions. Wooden spheres sliding on rods, a gentle percussion accompanying discussions of slaughter. The generals would propose a campaign, and the tall scholar would run numbers, and sometimes the numbers would say something the generals didn't want to hear. He began, tentatively, to suggest alternatives. The Mongol approach to conquered peoples was straightforward. Take everything useful, kill everyone resistant, move on. This worked well for nomads who didn't intend to stay. It worked poorly for building anything lasting. Yelu Chucai started pointing out that dead farmers couldn't plant next year's crops. That burned cities couldn't pay tribute. That emptied lands offered nothing to extract. The warriors listened with the tolerant skepticism of men being told that vegetables are delicious. They had conquered the world with swords, not spreadsheets. Why would they change now? But Yelu Chucai had time. He had the Khan's ear. And he had something the generals lacked: the ability to express death in terms of opportunity cost. Every slaughtered peasant was a potential taxpayer eliminated. Every razed city was a supply depot destroyed. Cruelty wasn't just immoral. It was inefficient. The scholar didn't frame his arguments in moral terms. He was far too smart for that. He spoke the language of wealth, of sustainable extraction, of long-term thinking versus short-term satisfaction. He was teaching wolves to see sheep as renewable resources rather than single meals. Some generals began to understand. Others never would. But the seed was planted, waiting for the right moment to bear terrible, pragmatic fruit. The moment came in 1229, and it smelled like ash. Genghis Khan had died 2 years earlier, leaving his empire to his son Ogedei. The new Khan inherited his father's generals, his father's ambitions, and his father's ongoing problem of what to do with northern China. The region had been conquered, technically, but it remained a chaotic patchwork of devastated cities, abandoned farms, and populations that kept stubbornly dying. Some generals proposed a solution with the elegant simplicity of men who had never planted anything in their lives. Empty the land entirely. Kill or relocate the remaining Chinese population. Turn the farmland back to pasture. Let horses graze where peasants had once toiled. This made perfect sense from a steppe perspective. Grassland was wealth. Cities were liabilities. Why maintain this strange sedentary infrastructure when you could return it to proper use? Yelu Chucai heard this proposal and understood that millions of lives hung on his response. He had perhaps one chance to make an argument that would resonate with men who measured value in herds, not harvests. He did not appeal to mercy. He did not cite Confucian principles of benevolent governance. He did not speak of the cultural treasures that would be lost, the civilizational continuity that would be severed, the human suffering that would result. He presented a spreadsheet. If you tax these people properly, he explained, if you let them farm and take a portion of their yield, you will receive 500,000 ounces of silver annually, 80,000 bolts of silk, 400,000 she of grain. And you will receive this every year, year after year, for as long as the peasants live and work. Dead farmers produce nothing. Empty fields yield no tribute. Pasture land might feed horses, but horses don't weave silk. The numbers sat in the air of the jur tent, suspended between life and death for an entire region. The generals who wanted extermination had emotion on their side, the visceral satisfaction of total victory. Yelu Chucai had arithmetic. Ogedei Khan listened. He was, perhaps, less naturally inclined toward mercy than his father had been in his later years. But he understood numbers. He understood that silk purchased loyalty among nobles, that silver paid armies, that grain sustained campaigns. He decided to test the bureaucrat's theory. The extermination was postponed. A census would be taken. Taxes would be assessed. Northern China would be administered rather than emptied. Yelu Chucai had just saved millions of lives using an abacus and some very cold language about human beings as renewable resources. Whether to celebrate or mourn this achievement remains genuinely unclear. He had won the argument by accepting its terms. People were assets, cruelty was waste, mercy was profitable. The rustling of census papers began to replace the tallying of corpses. Not everywhere. Not completely. But enough. The logic of extraction requires something to extract from, and that something, for the first time in Mongol administrative history, would be kept alive on purpose. Under Ogedei's reign, Yelu Chucai reached the peak of his influence, and he used every moment of it building systems that would outlast him. He created a taxation structure modeled on Chinese precedents but adapted from Mongol realities. fixed rates, regular collection, documented assessments. No more arbitrary seizures that left populations destitute and therefore unproductive. The empire would take much, but it would take consistently, and the peasants would know what to expect. He established granaries throughout the conquered territories, warehouses of grain that could buffer against famines and supply armies without stripping regions bare. This was not charity. This was insurance. Starved populations rebel or die, and either outcome interrupted revenue. He founded schools, Confucian academies teaching classical texts to a new generation, producing the educated administrators the empire desperately needed. Mongol warriors could conquer, but they could not govern. They needed men trained in the arts of civilization, and those men needed to be trained somewhere. He introduced paper currency, standardizing exchange across an empire that stretched from Korea to Persia. The rustle of printed money replacing the clink of disparate coinages, the first steps toward an integrated economy that could actually function. He instituted civil service examinations, though in modified form. The Mongols would never fully embrace the Chinese system of selecting officials through competitive testing, but Yelu Chucai planted the seeds. He argued was more reliable than birth. Competent administrators produced better returns than noble sons. The machine he built was not kind. Let us be very clear about this. It was a system designed to extract maximum sustainable value from conquered populations. The key word was sustainable, which marked an improvement over previous methods, but the extraction remained brutal, comprehensive, relentless. Yelu Chucai understood this. He was not naive. He had chosen to save lives through a logic that treated those lives as productive assets, and the horror of that framing never entirely left him. Buddhist philosophy offered some comfort, the recognition that all worldly achievements are temporary, that reducing suffering even through compromised means carried merit. But late at night, in whatever quarters the traveling court provided, did he ever lie awake calculating different numbers? The millions who lived because of his intervention? The millions who still died despite it? The impossible mathematics of partial mercy in service of efficient empire? The records don't say. The records only show what was built, and what was built was a machine for humane exploitation, which is exactly as contradictory as it sounds. The thing about systematic taxation is that it annoys everyone who preferred chaos. Central Asian Muslim merchants had done very well under the old arrangements. They bought tax farming rights from Mongol princes, paid a lump sum up front, and then squeezed conquered populations for every possible coin. Whatever they extracted beyond their initial payment was pure profit. The incentives were obvious and obviously terrible. Maximize short-term extraction regardless of long-term consequences. Yelu Chucai's regulated system threatened all of this. Fixed tax rates meant predictable income for the state, but limited opportunities for private enrichment. Documented assessments meant accountability. Protection for peasants meant merchants couldn't simply take everything. The Ortog, as these merchant associations were called, began whispering in Agede's ear. The Khan had a weakness. He drank. He drank enthusiastically, continuously, and with the dedication of a man racing toward his own grave. Ministers installed a device to limit his daily wine intake. Ogadei simply used larger cups. In this fog of alcohol, the careful arguments of a sober bureaucrat competed poorly with the entertaining company of wealthy merchants bearing gifts. They called Yelu Chucai too sympathetic to Chinese interests. They suggested his loyalty lay with his own people rather than his Mongol masters. They offered alternative arrangements that promised more immediate wealth, never mentioning that such wealth came from stripping assets rather than cultivating them. The whispers worked. Ogadei began bypassing his chief administrator, granting special privileges to merchant groups, allowing the tax farming arrangements that Yelu Chucai had labored to abolish. The careful system started developing holes. Provincial officials who owed their positions to the examination system found themselves undermined by favorites who owed theirs to bribes. Yelu Chucai protested. He presented data. He explained, again, the mathematics of sustainable extraction versus short-term stripping. But mathematics compete poorly against profit in politics, especially when the person who needs convincing is seldom sober enough to follow the argument. The scholar watched his life's work being dismantled by men who would rather feast on a corpse than maintain a living system. The granaries he'd established were raided. The tax rates he'd fixed were ignored. The bureaucracy he'd built was hollowed out from within. He remained at court because leaving would mean abandoning what little influence he retained. But the smell of the Jur tents had changed. It still carried leather and smoke, but now it carried something else. The particular scent of decay that accompanies institutions being gutted for parts. Yelu Chucai died in 1243, reportedly of grief. This might sound melodramatic, but consider what he witnessed in his final years. The examination system gutted. The tax regulations circumvented. The granaries emptied. The careful balance he'd constructed between extraction and sustainability tilting decisively toward extraction. Everything he'd built being stripped for short-term gain by men who would be dead before the consequences arrived. He was 63 years old, which was ancient by the standards of the time. He had served 3 khans. He had personally convinced the most violent conquerors in human history that murder could be economically suboptimal. He had saved millions of lives using arguments that treated those lives as revenue streams. And now he watched it all crumble, and some part of him simply stopped. The records say he fell ill and declined rapidly, which is what records always say when a man loses the will to continue. His body remained in the world for a few more months. His spirit had already left. But here is the strange thing. His legacy persisted. Not completely. The Mongol Empire never became the model of enlightened administration he'd envisioned. But it never became the pastoral wasteland some generals had wanted either. The Yuan dynasty that eventually emerged in China retained many of his structures, adapted and corrupted but still recognizable. The principle he'd established, that conquered peoples were worth more alive and productive, survived him. Centuries later, the system he built would evolve into the administrative frameworks that governed China through multiple dynasties. The examinations he championed would become the model for civil service selection worldwide. The census techniques he developed would inform how empires counted their subjects for generations. and the moral calculus he performed would repeat itself endlessly. Every authoritarian regime that employs technocrats to make its brutality more efficient is running Yelu Chucai's program. Every policy expert who reduces atrocity through argument rather than principle. Every reformer who saves lives by making them more valuable to power. Every bureaucrat who measures success in deaths that didn't happen, in horrors that proved logistically inconvenient, in populations that remained exploited rather than exterminated. The mathematics haven't changed. The desperation hasn't changed. The terrible bargain hasn't changed. Somewhere, right now, someone in a position of limited influence is making calculations that will determine whether people live or die. They are not speaking in moral terms because moral terms don't work on the people they're trying to convince. They are speaking the language of efficiency, of sustainability, of long-term returns. They are selling mercy as profit because profit is the only currency their masters understand. Yelu Chucai would recognize them. He would understand their compromises and their failures and their quiet, impossible hopes that the machine they're building might somehow become less terrible over time. He would know, too, the thing they learn eventually. The machine doesn't care about your intentions. It only cares about what it produces. The abacus beads still click. The census papers still rustle. The calculation continues, measuring lives against yields, weighing suffering against revenue, attempting the impossible arithmetic of making horror slightly more bearable by making it slightly more systematic. It's not enough. It was never enough. But some nights, when the numbers come out slightly less terrible than they might have been, it feels like something. And sometimes, that has to be enough. The scene unfolds in kitchens and living rooms across the world, so ordinary it barely registers as a scene at all. A child yawns, mouth stretching wide, and somewhere nearby an adult voice materializes with gentle correction. Cover your mouth, dear. It's polite. And the child complies, learns, internalizes, grows up to correct their own children with the same patient explanation. Cover your mouth when you yawn. It's just good manners. Except it isn't. Or rather, it is now, but it wasn't always. The gesture predates the concept of manners by several centuries. What we're teaching children isn't etiquette. It's fossilized terror wrapped in the language of social grace. Somewhere in the genetic memory of Western civilization, there's a screaming medieval peasant convinced that the simple act of yawning with an uncovered mouth might cost them everything that matters. Their immortal soul. Their spiritual integrity. Their protection against forces that hunger for exactly the kind of opening a yawn provides. But we've forgotten that part. We've smoothed the edges, replaced the fear with politeness, and kept performing the ritual without remembering why it exists. Every time a parent reaches out to guide a child's hand toward their mouth during a yawn, they're reenacting a moment of desperate spiritual self-defense that stretches back 700 years. The question isn't why we cover our mouths. The question is what exactly our ancestors thought they were keeping out. Or keeping in. because medieval people didn't worry about yawning because it looked rude. They worried about yawning because the mouth, flung open and unguarded, represented something genuinely terrifying, a moment of profound vulnerability when the barrier between the self and everything that wanted to corrupt or consume it simply disappeared. What we call manners, they called survival. And somehow, across centuries of enlightenment and rationalism and scientific revolution, we never stopped doing it. We just stopped knowing why. The medieval body was not a body in the modern sense. It was a fortress, a walled city of flesh and bone, constantly under siege by forces both visible and invisible, with every opening representing a potential breach in the defenses. The eyes could be corrupted by sinful sights. The ears could admit whispered temptations. The nose could draw in corrupted air, carrying disease and demonic influence in equal measure. But the mouth was the great vulnerability, the primary gate, the opening that not only let things in, but actively expelled things out. And a yawn was the moment when that gate swung wide without permission. Consider what happens during a yawn. The jaw opens, not by choice, but by compulsion. The body takes control away from the will. The mouth stretches to its widest possible aperture and holds there, exposed and undefended, for several long seconds. The breath moves strangely, neither fully in nor fully out, suspended in that liminal space where control has temporarily evacuated. For medieval people, this wasn't just uncomfortable. It was spiritually catastrophic. They could feel it happening, that involuntary surrender of bodily authority. The way the yawn seized them without warning, demanded its moment, left them gaping and helpless until it decided to release its grip. Every other bodily opening could be guarded by choice. A person could close their eyes, cover their ears, pinch their nose. But a yawn arrived like an invader, forced the gates open, and held them there while the whole world watched. The sensation itself carried an edge of wrongness. That strange, almost painful stretch of the jaw. The way the ears seemed to muffle and ring. The momentary dizziness, the watering eyes, the peculiar vulnerability of being caught mid-yawn, unable to speak or close or defend. In a world where the body was understood as the soul's fortress, the yawn was a siege engine. It arrived without warning. It overwhelmed the defenses. And it left the gates hanging open while darkness gathered outside. What entered during those unguarded seconds? What escaped? Medieval theologians had very specific, very terrifying answers to both questions. The soul lived in the breath. This wasn't metaphor for medieval Christians. It was theological fact. God had breathed life into Adam, and that divine breath became the animating principle of human existence. The soul didn't just inhabit the body like a tenant in a house. It moved through the breath, rode the air in and out, maintained its grip on mortal flesh through the constant rhythm of respiration, which made breathing a spiritually significant act. Every exhale carried a fragment of the soul outward. Every inhale drew it back. The system worked beautifully under normal circumstances, a continuous circulation that kept body and spirit bound together in their necessary partnership. But a yawn wasn't normal breathing. A yawn was breath escaping in a great uncontrolled rush through an opening far wider than nature intended. And if the soul traveled in the breath, then a yawn was exactly the kind of catastrophic breach that might let it slip free entirely. People claim to have seen it happen. Deathbed accounts described the soul leaving the body as a visible vapor, rising from the mouth in the final exhale. If death released the soul through breath, couldn't a sufficiently powerful yawn accomplish the same accidental evacuation? The fear wasn't entirely irrational, given the premises. Yawning did feel like something leaving. That strange, compulsive need to open wide and expel, the momentary lightheadedness that followed, the odd sensation of having been briefly emptied. Medieval people interpreted these feelings through the only framework available to them, and the framework said the soul was in danger. Mothers watched their children yawn and felt genuine terror. Not the mild social discomfort of witnessing poor manners, but the visceral panic of seeing their child's immortal essence attempting to flee through an unguarded gate. The hand that flew up to cover the mouth wasn't performing etiquette. It was performing emergency containment. Keep it in. Keep the soul in. Don't let it escape through carelessness or inattention. The yawn would pass, the compulsion would fade, but only if the breath and the soul it carried was prevented from making its desperate bid for freedom. The gesture was fast, reflexive, urgent. Because by the time the yawn finished, it might already be too late. But losing the soul was only half the danger. The other half was worse. The medieval world was crowded with invisible presences, and most of them were not friendly. Demons swarmed the air like gnats, theologically speaking. Fallen angels, minor devils, unclean spirits of every variety, all of them restless and hungry and perpetually seeking entry into human hosts. They couldn't force their way in, not under normal circumstances. The sole fortress of the body was designed to resist them. But they could watch. They could wait. And they could seize any opportunity that carelessness or sin might provide. A yawn was exactly such an opportunity. The mouth hung open, undefended, while the will that normally guarded it was temporarily suspended. The demons gathered and watched and calculated their moment. If the opening stayed unprotected long enough, they could slip inside, take up residence in the newly vulnerable interior, and begin their corrupting work from within. Church authorities took this threat seriously enough to address it directly. Sermons warned against careless yawning. Theological texts discussed the spiritual mechanics of demonic entry. The advice was consistent and urgent. When the yawn came, cover the mouth. Create a barrier. Don't give them the opening they're waiting for. The sign of the cross became the first line of defense, traced quickly over the gaping mouth to invoke divine protection at the moment of greatest vulnerability. The gesture blessed the opening, transformed it from an invitation into a warning, told the watching demons that this particular breach was defended even if the physical gate stood open. But not everyone could make the sign quickly enough. Not everyone remembered in that involuntary moment when the yawn seized control. And so the hand became the backup, the physical barrier that supplemented spiritual protection, the wall that stood between the open mouth and everything that wanted to enter it. The terror was specific and visceral. Demonic possession began with exactly this kind of careless moment. A yawn in the wrong place, at the wrong time, without the proper protections. And then the slow corruption from within, the loss of self, the surrender to forces that had been waiting patiently for their chance. Parents didn't correct children's yawning habits out of concern for appearances. They corrected them because they genuinely believed an uncovered yawn might be the first step toward losing their child to something unspeakable. Cover your mouth. It wasn't advice. It was a desperate warning. Sacred spaces made everything worse. If demons lurked everywhere in the ordinary world, they practically swarmed in places dedicated to God, drawn by the chance to corrupt what was holy, to spoil what was pure, to claim souls in the very act of worship. The medieval church during Mass was a battlefield, and the congregation was surrounded. Which meant that yawning in church wasn't just spiritually dangerous. It was spiritually catastrophic. The mouth opened in a space already thick with demonic presence, at a moment when attention was supposed to be focused entirely on the divine. It was carelessness compounded by location, vulnerability multiplied by sacred context. The priest's reaction to an uncovered yawn in the congregation was not subtle. A sharp intake of breath, perhaps. A momentary pause in the liturgy. A look of genuine horror directed at the offender. Because the priest understood what was at stake, understood that the brief, involuntary opening might have just admitted something terrible into the sanctuary. Mothers in the pews watched their children with predatory attention, waiting for the first sign of an approaching yawn. The sleepiness that preceded it, the deep breath, the beginning of the jaw's involuntary descent. And then the hand, not the child's hand, but the mother's, slapping across the small face with enough force to leave a mark. This wasn't cruelty. This was crisis intervention. The sound of it carried through the quiet church, that sharp crack of palm against cheek, and the congregation understood. A yawn had been intercepted. A soul had been protected. The mother had acted quickly enough. This time. Children grew up learning to fear their own yawns in sacred spaces. The feeling of sleepiness during a long sermon became a source of anxiety rather than mere discomfort. If the yawn came, if it caught them unprepared, the consequences extended far beyond a slap from their mother. Their very soul might be forfeit, lost in a moment of involuntary carelessness while standing in the house of God. The shame of an uncovered church yawn could follow a person for years. Neighbors remembered. Priests remembered. The community knew who had been careless with their spiritual defenses, who had opened themselves to corruption in the most dangerous possible environment. Cover your mouth in church. Cover it faster than anywhere else? The stakes were simply too high to risk otherwise. Defense required technique. Spiritual warfare was not improvised. The sign of the cross over the mouth became the gold standard for yawn protection, a quick gesture that invoked divine power at the precise moment of vulnerability. The right hand moved from forehead to chest, shoulder to shoulder, all compressed into a fraction of a second, blessing the open gate before anything could pass through it in either direction. Priests taught it. Parents drilled it. Children practiced until the motion became automatic, a reflex that fired the instant the jaw began its involuntary descent. The The sign didn't just protect, it sanctified. It transformed the dangerous opening into a moment of prayer, converting vulnerability into devotion through the simple geometry of crossed lines. But the sign required a free hand and a clear mind, and yawns were notorious for arriving at inconvenient moments. Hands busy with work. Minds fogged by exhaustion. The compulsion seizing control before the protective reflex could engage. And so the hand alone became acceptable. The palm pressed against the mouth, creating a physical barrier that substituted for spiritual blessing when speed mattered more than form. Better an unblessed hand than an unprotected opening. Better a crude wall than no wall at all. The gesture simplified over generations. The full sign of the cross compressed into a quick touch of fingers to lips. The emergency palm slap softened into a gentle covering. The theological urgency faded, but the motion persisted, passed from parent to child as reflex rather than ritual. Something interesting was happening. The meaning was draining out of the gesture, while the gesture itself remained perfectly preserved. People who no longer believed in soul escape or demonic entry still covered their mouths when they yawned. The hand still flew up, automatic and unquestioned, protecting against a danger that had been forgotten but never stopped feeling real. The body remembered what the mind had discarded. Centuries of terror had carved grooves into collective behavior, channels that continued to guide action long after the original fear had evaporated. The gesture became pure form, motion without meaning, a spiritual defense that had been translated into muscle memory and then had its original language erased. By the time the Enlightenment arrived to sweep away medieval superstition, the hand was already moving on its own. No one needed to believe in demons anymore. The covering would continue regardless. The Enlightenment had a genius for translation. It took the old fears, stripped them of their supernatural content, and repackaged them as social concerns. What had been theology became etiquette. What had been spiritual survival became good breeding. Yawning underwent exactly this transformation. By the 18th century, educated Europeans no longer worried about souls escaping or demons entering. Such beliefs belonged to an embarrassing past, best forgotten by reasonable people in an age of reason. But the yawning gesture remained, and it needed a new explanation. Etiquette provided one. The open mouth was rude. It displayed the interior of the body, which polite society agreed should remain interior. It suggested boredom, disengagement, insufficient interest in one's company. The yawn was no longer spiritually dangerous, but it was socially catastrophic. In covering, it was the mark of refinement. The fear survived by changing costumes. Where medieval parents had slapped hands over children's mouths to prevent soul loss, Enlightenment parents corrected the same gesture to prevent social embarrassment. The motion remained identical. The urgency remained similar. Only the stated reason had changed. Etiquette books of the period devoted careful attention to the yawn. How to suppress it if possible, how to cover it if not, how to excuse oneself if caught. The language was social rather than theological, but the underlying anxiety echoed through the centuries. An uncovered yawn remained, somehow, a serious violation requiring correction. What the etiquette writers didn't discuss, perhaps didn't even realize, was that they were inheriting a gesture rather than inventing one. The covered yawn wasn't a new development of refined society. It was an old defense mechanism looking for new justification. Generation after generation passed the behavior forward, each one providing their own explanation. Politeness, hygiene, consideration for others, preventing the spread of germs. Each explanation made perfect sense in its own context and completely obscured the original terror hiding underneath. The demon had been replaced by the faux pas. The escaping soul had become the exposed tonsils. But the hand still flew to the mouth with the same instinctive urgency, and nobody stopped to wonder why the reflex felt so much older than the reasons given for it. Manners had eaten the memory. The fear was gone, supposedly. But the gesture protecting against it remained as strong as ever. Watch a child yawn today, uncovered and unashamed, and notice the reaction it provokes. Not horror exactly. Something subtler. A mild discomfort, a faint wrongness, an instinct to correct that precedes any conscious thought about why correction is necessary. Parents reach out to guide little hands toward little mouths with the same automatic urgency their ancestors displayed, even though the theological emergency has been forgotten for centuries. The gesture feels important in a way that defies the weak explanations we give for it. Cover your mouth because it's polite, we say, and we believe ourselves, and we don't ask why politeness requires this particular motion, this particular speed, this particular anxiety. The medieval peasant screaming about demons has been thoroughly civilized, turned into a gentle reminder about manners, dressed up in the language of social consideration and released into the modern world where it continues to propagate without anyone questioning its origins. But the body knows. Somewhere beneath consciousness, the reflex carries its history. That flash of discomfort when someone yawns with mouth wide open isn't really about rudeness. It's the echo of an old terror, still resonating in neural pathways that learned their lessons 700 years ago and never forgot. We've rationalized it, secularized it, stripped it of every trace of the supernatural fear that created it. And still we keep doing it, every single time the yawn arrives, without fail, as though something terrible might happen if we stopped. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If we no longer believe in souls escaping or demons entering, why does the uncovered yawn still feel so wrong? Why do we still correct it in children with the same urgency our ancestors applied? Why hasn't the gesture faded away along with the belief that originally demanded it? Perhaps because rituals don't need reasons to survive. Perhaps because fear, once it carves deep enough into a culture, doesn't require continued belief to perpetuate itself. The motion becomes the meaning. The gesture becomes the justification. We cover our mouths because we've always covered our mouths, and the original why has been swallowed by the endless repetition of what? 7 centuries of soul guarding compressed into a single small motion. And we think we're just being polite. The sun sets over Paris, and something shifts in the shadows near Notre Dame. The respectable citizens quicken their pace, pulling cloaks tighter, suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere. Because everyone knows what happens in the narrow alleys behind the great cathedral once darkness falls. The blind begin to see. The lame begin to walk. and the beggars of Paris clock out from their day jobs. The Court of Miracles doesn't announce itself. It seeps. One moment, a visitor is walking through a cramped passage that smells of cabbage water and human proximity. The next, they've crossed an invisible border into a kingdom that exists on no official map. The geography is intentional, a maze of dead ends and false turns designed to swallow pursuit. Royal guards who venture and rarely venture out with their dignity intact. Or their purses. The smell arrives first, of course. Unwashed bodies packed into airless rooms, cheap wine gone sour, the particular mustiness of clothes that have never fully dried. Underneath it all, something almost sweet, the rot of vegetable scraps and the perpetual dampness of stone that never sees proper sunlight. It's not pleasant, but it's honest in its way. More honest than what comes next. Torchlight flickers against walls blackened by decades of smoke. Faces emerge from doorways, assessing, calculating. And then the miracles begin. A man who spent the day outside St. Eustache, eyes rolled back, hand extended in trembling supplication, now removes his eye patches and squints at the evening's take with perfectly functional vision. A woman who dragged herself through the marais on twisted legs stands upright, stretches her back, and complains about the cobblestones. Prosthetic sores peel away like theater makeup. Bound limbs unfold. The hunched straighten. It's not healing. It's the end of a shift. The transformation happens casually, almost boringly. Veterans don't even pause their conversations. They discuss the day's earnings in argot, the secret language that marks them as members of this particular nation. Words that sound like French but aren't quite, a professional vocabulary for marks, techniques, and the eternal question of who owes what to whom. The cant echoes off the narrow walls, mixing with laughter and the clatter of coins being counted. Somewhere deeper in the labyrinth, a figure waits on something that might generously be called a throne. But we'll get to him. First, it's worth understanding what this place actually is. Not a den of thieves, exactly. Not mere desperation given an address. The Court of Miracles is a corporation, a guild, a government in miniature. It has rules. It has taxes. It has incredibly professional standards. The beggars of Paris didn't just survive. They organized. And their organization would have made the royal bureaucracy weep with envy if the royal bureaucracy had ever bothered to look closely at the people it stepped over every day. But respectable Paris preferred not to look. Which, as it turned out, was exactly what the court was counting on. Every kingdom needs a king, even the ones that smell like this. The Grand Coesre sits at the heart of the Court of Miracles, and his title translates roughly to something between emperor and chief executive. He is elected, not born to power, which already makes him more democratic than the Bourbon sitting in Versailles. His subjects choose him for competence, connections, and the delicate art of keeping several thousand professional criminals from murdering each other over territorial disputes. The throne itself is less impressive than the title suggests. A sturdy chair, perhaps a salvaged piece of furniture from some bourgeois household that experienced unexpected redistribution of property. But the man who occupies it commands genuine authority. He adjudicates disputes. He assigns territories. He sets tax rates. He can, when circumstances require, order executions. Around him, a court takes shape that mirrors the one across the river with almost satirical precision. The Grand Coesre has his ministers, his advisors, his regional governors called Cugots, who manage the provincial courts scattered across France. Because this isn't just a Parisian phenomenon. The organization has chapters in Lyon, Bordeaux, Toulouse, each reporting upward through a hierarchy that would make a Jesuit proud. The irony is almost too perfect to be accidental. While Louis XRV perfects the rituals of absolute monarchy at Versailles, complete with elaborate ceremonies for watching him wake up and go to bed, the Grand Coesre runs a parallel government for everyone the Sun King would prefer not to see. Both courts have etiquette. Both courts have favorites. Both courts run on a sophisticated understanding of who owes what to whom. The difference is that the beggar king's subjects chose him, and they can unchoose him if he stops delivering results. This is constitutional monarchy for the dispossessed. It's messy, sometimes violent, and it operates entirely outside the law. But it works. Disputes get resolved. Resources get distributed. The weak receive protection from the strong, assuming they pay their dues. Which, to be fair, is more than the official government offers most of its citizens. The Grand Coesre doesn't rule by divine right. He rules by demonstrated value. And in the Court of Miracles, value is measured in very specific coins. Begging, it turns out, is a profession. And like any profession, it has specializations. The Court of Miracles maintains a taxonomy of suffering that would impress a medieval scholar. Each category has a name, a technique, a set of props, and most importantly, an assigned territory. Because nothing destroys profit margins quite like two fake blind men working the same church steps. The Moulingru specialize in illness. They cultivate the pallor of the genuinely sick, learning to cough with convincing wetness, to tremble with fever that isn't there. Some coat their skin with preparations that raise convincing welts. Others simply master the art of looking like death might be a mercy. Their training involves studying the actually ill, observing symptoms with the clinical precision of physicians who intend to fake what they've learned. The Pietre handle disability. These are the false cripples, the performers who bind their limbs into contorted positions for hours, who drag themselves through streets on padded knees. The good ones develop calluses that sell the story. The great ones learn to suppress any flicker of discomfort in their eyes, because audiences are remarkably perceptive about pain. A Pietra who winces wrong loses credibility, and credibility is the only currency that matters. The Saboulot fake epilepsy. This requires genuine athletic ability, the capacity to throw oneself to the ground and convulse convincingly without actually injuring anything important. They carry small pouches of soap that, bitten at the right moment, produce impressive foam at the mouth. The technique is dangerous. Get the timing wrong and the performance becomes unintentionally authentic. The Francs Matou are wound specialists. They create injuries so realistic that even physicians occasionally get fooled. The recipes are closely guarded trade secrets. Mixtures of rust and fat that mimic infected flesh, strategically placed animal blood, prosthetics made from actual skin donated, willingly or otherwise, by the deceased. A master Franc-Matou can produce a suppurating sword that generates sympathy from 50 feet away. And these are just the major categories. Subsections abound. There are specialists in veteran impersonation, in orphan performance, in religious pilgrims fallen on hard times. Each niche has its market, its techniques, its professional associations. Newcomers to the court don't simply start begging. They apprentice. A senior member teaches them the craft, how to read a crowd, which hours produce the best returns, where the generous churches are and where the violent ones lurk. They learn to spot undercover authorities. They memorize the argot that identifies friend from foe. They practice their chosen specialty until the performance becomes second nature. Quality control exists. A poorly executed fake illness reflects badly on the entire profession. The obviously faking beggar draws attention, which draws officials, which creates problems for everyone. So the court maintains standards. Performances are observed. Critiques are offered. Those who cannot meet professional expectations are reassigned or, in extreme cases, expelled. This isn't desperation performing itself. This is craft. The beggars of the Court of Miracles understood something that modern economists would eventually rediscover. Sympathy is a resource, and resources respond to optimization. They optimized. They specialized. They turned poverty into the most elaborate performance art in Europe, staged daily across a city that never suspected the performers were reading from the same script. Sympathy, once harvested, must be processed. The Court of Miracles runs a remarkably sophisticated economy built on the raw material of human compassion. Every member pays taxes. The standard rate hovers between 10 and 20% of daily earnings, collected with a regularity that the royal tax farmers would envy. Collectors make their rounds each evening, tallying contributions, noting shortfalls. Payment isn't optional. The court provides protection, territory, training, and dispute resolution. These services have costs. Members who forget this truth receive pointed reminders. Territory itself is the primary asset. The steps of Saint-Sulpice generate different returns than the approaches to Les Halles. Prime locations near wealthy parishes command premium prices, paid either in lump sums or ongoing percentage increases. A beggar might work years to earn the right to a lucrative corner, or might purchase the position outright from a retiring practitioner. The court brokers these transactions, taking a cut naturally and enforcing the agreements afterward. Market management prevents the kind of oversaturation that destroys profitability. Too many fake blind men near Notre Dame and the marks get suspicious. The returns diminish, the entire category suffers. So the Grand Coesre's administrators track supply and demand with surprising precision. They limit licenses for oversaturated specialties. They encourage migration to underserved territories. They maintain, in essence, a cartel. The economics extend beyond begging itself. The court serves as a fence for stolen goods, providing a reliable market for the thieves who operate under its protection. Prices are lower than a legitimate sale might fetch, obviously, but the transaction happens safely, quickly, without awkward questions. The thieves accept the discount. The court takes its percentage. Money lending flourishes within the community. Members who need advances against future earnings can borrow from those who've accumulated surplus. Interest rates are steep but not ruinous, regulated to prevent the kind of predatory spiraling that might drive members to desperate action. A debtor who can't work generates no returns for anyone. The court understands this. Its lending practices reflect a cold but functional logic. There's even a primitive form of insurance. Members who fall genuinely ill, who suffer injuries that prevent work, can draw from collective funds accumulated through the tax system. The payments won't make anyone comfortable, but they prevent starvation. They maintain loyalty. They ensure that membership in the court means something beyond a daily shakedown. The whole apparatus operates parallel to official Paris, intersecting occasionally through bribery, but mostly simply ignoring the legitimate economy altogether. The beggars have their own currency of favors and obligations, their own credit ratings based on reputation, their own investment opportunities in prime territory or promising apprentices. It's capitalism, essentially, just built on a commodity that polite society pretends doesn't exist. Every society needs courts. The Court of Miracles, despite the name, actually has several. Disputes arise constantly in any community, and a community of professional criminals generates more than most. Territory conflicts, accusations of informing, debts unpaid, apprentices stolen. The official justice system is not available for resolution. The official justice system would hang most petitioners before hearing their complaints. So the court provides its own. The Grand Quezri serves as final arbiter, but most cases never reach him. Regional Kugo handle routine matters, determining who actually had rights to a contested corner, adjudicating whether a debt was legitimately owed, settling the endless squabbles that arise when people live in each other's pockets. The process resembles legitimate jurisprudence closely enough to be recognizable. Witnesses testify. Evidence is considered. Decisions are rendered. Punishments scale with offense. Minor infractions generate fines, payable to the wronged party and to the court's general fund. Theft from fellow members, a serious breach of professional ethics, results in public shaming and temporary exile from protected territories. The offender must work the worst locations until trust rebuilds. Violent crimes receive violent responses. Assault might result in reciprocal injury, carefully administered to match the original offense. The court believes in proportionality. It also believes in witnesses. Punishments happen publicly, serving as deterrent and entertainment simultaneously. Informers face the harshest consequences. Betraying the court to authorities threatens everyone. The punishment is death, administered with enough creativity to ensure the lesson spreads. Bodies occasionally surface in the Seine with distinctive marks. The authorities understand the message. The court polices itself. Thanks very much, and interference will cost more than it's worth. The irony cuts deep. Royal justice in 17th century France is arbitrary, slow, and available primarily to those who can afford to purchase it. The Court of Miracles offers something faster and more predictable. A beggar who brings a grievance knows roughly what to expect. The rules are clear. The process is transparent, at least within the community. Outcomes correlate to evidence rather than social status. This isn't to romanticize what is, ultimately, criminal organization enforcing its will through violence. But it's worth noting what fills the vacuum when official institutions fail their most vulnerable members. Something fills it. The something is rarely pretty, but it functions after a fashion for those who have no other options. The beggars of Paris speak French. They also speak something else. Argot is the secret language of the court, a vocabulary designed to exclude outsiders and protect operations. It marks membership more surely than any badge could. A stranger might dress like a beggar, might even perform the role convincingly. But the stranger who doesn't know the right words reveals themselves instantly. The terminology is precise and practical. Marks have categories based on vulnerability. The pious who give near churches, the guilty who give near brothels, the drunk who give everywhere. Police have names that change depending on proximity and threat level. Escape routes have coded references that mean nothing to anyone not initiated. A conversation about weather might actually coordinate a complex theft. Words for specific scams carry their own poetry. The technique of faking a seizure has one name. The technique of pretending to find dropped money to gain trust has another. Every established con earns its own entry in the vocabulary, a shorthand that allows rapid communication in crowded spaces where speaking plainly would invite disaster. The language serves security, obviously, but it serves something else too: belonging. The argot creates a we and a them, a community defined by shared knowledge. A beggar who masters the vocabulary becomes one of the people, entitled to protection and respect. The language is a citizenship test that never formally happens but always matters. Some words escape. Argot terms leak into mainstream French, adopted by slumming nobles who think they're being daring, picked up by writers seeking authentic flavor. The word for police. The word for money. Phrases that enter common use, stripped of their original context, no longer marking membership in anything. It's a strange legacy. The Court of Miracles is gone, swept away by history and royal authority. But fragments of its language survive in modern French, ghosts of a kingdom that existed in shadows and spoken code. The criminals created culture. The culture outlasted the crime. Parisians still use words invented by beggars 4 centuries dead without knowing it, without caring. The invisible remain invisible, even in the words they leave behind. The boundary between respectable Paris and the Court of Miracles was always more permeable than either side preferred to admit. Noble slummed. It was fashionable in certain circles to venture into the dangerous quarters with an armed escort and a taste for transgression. Young aristocrats seeking thrills paid guides to show them the court's edges, safely distant from actual crime but close enough to feel daring. They returned to their salons with stories carefully edited to emphasize their own bravery and minimize the genuine risk of violence. The court tolerated these visits. Wealthy tourists with loose purses and looser lips provided intelligence about upper-class movements, schedules, and vulnerabilities. A noble's casual mention of a wedding or a funeral revealed when houses would be empty, when jewelry would be traveling, when opportunity would knock. The slumming aristocrats thought they were observing the poor. The poor were taking notes. Officials participated too, though less openly. Police sergeants accepted regular payments to look elsewhere. Magistrates discovered that certain neighborhoods generated insufficient evidence for prosecution. The bribes flowed upward through predictable channels, and in return, the court operated with remarkable freedom. This wasn't corruption exactly. It was taxation by another name, a cost of doing business that everyone understood. The arrangement held as long as the court remained invisible to people who mattered. Visibility destroyed everything. Riots that drew attention, crimes against the wrong victims, any event that forced official notice required official response. After the response, the bribes renegotiated at higher rates, and everyone pretended normalcy returned. Crisis years swelled the court's population. Plague brought the newly infected seeking care their families couldn't provide. Famine brought the newly hungry seeking survival their villages couldn't offer. Economic collapse brought artisans and merchants who never imagined themselves begging, now learning the techniques from professionals. The court absorbed them all, trained the trainable, exploited the desperate. These moments of crisis revealed something uncomfortable about the relationship between the two Paris cities. The respectable one needed the other, at least in the sense of needing somewhere for its failures to go. The Court of Miracles was a pressure valve. Better the desperate concentrate themselves in manageable locations than spread unpredictably through streets that mattered. Better they police themselves than require resources from overstretched authorities. The arrangement was ugly. It was also functional. And it lasted for decades, a shadow compact between power and powerlessness that neither side ever formally acknowledged. Louis XIV did not appreciate parallel governments. In 1656, he ended the arrangement. The Hospital General was not, despite its name, a hospital. It was a network of institutions designed to remove the poor from Parisian streets by force. The rhetoric spoke of charity and reform. The practice involved mass roundups, indefinite detention, and mandatory labor. Beggars who once paid taxes to the Grand Coesre now broke rocks for the glory of God and King. The courts of miracles didn't fall in a single night. They eroded over years of pressure, raids, and arrests. The organization that had survived for generations couldn't survive a monarch who decided that visible poverty reflected poorly on his reign. The Kugo fled to provinces or prisons. The Grand Coesre's throne stood empty. The labyrinth of alleys remained, but the kingdom within them dissolved. What replaced it was arguably worse. The Hospital General warehoused tens of thousands of poor Parisians in conditions that made the Court of Miracles look luxurious. There was no elected leadership, no dispute resolution, no apprenticeship in useful skills. There was forced labor, inadequate food, and the constant surveillance of moral reformers who believed poverty resulted from sin. The new system didn't cure begging. It simply moved beggars out of sight. But the model survived. Not the specific institutions, those crumbled too. The insight underneath them. The beggars of the court understood something fundamental about human economy. Sympathy is a resource. Vulnerability, performed skillfully, generates returns. The gap between authentic suffering and strategic presentation of suffering is narrower than comfortable people prefer to believe. And those who master this gap can monetize it. The modern echo is almost too obvious. Influencers craft narratives of struggle for audiences who respond with follows and funds. Gig workers perform enthusiasm for jobs that offer no security. Everyone optimizes their visible vulnerability, presenting curated hardship to algorithms that reward engagement. The Grand Coesri would recognize the game immediately. Only the technology has changed. The Beggars never wrote treatises on economics. They didn't need to. They lived the principles directly, turning performed misery into structured prosperity, building institutions from the material of sympathy itself. Their kingdom fell because power always destroys what it cannot control. But their insight endures. Sympathy is a resource. Vulnerability performs. And the invisible, given enough time, always find ways to make themselves seen on terms that profit them. The Court of Miracles is gone. Its lessons are everywhere. We just call them by different names now and pretend we invented them ourselves.